This is Northpod, a North Melbourne fan podcast, hosted by Jason Hunt.
Stevenson with his own move. Carrington. North are in front.
Hello and welcome back to episode 7 of this season of Northpod. It's me, Jason, again here. Going to break down the St Kilda practice match from the weekend and talk all things North Melbourne for another 40 minutes or so. So strap yourself in and get ready for some exhilarating analysis of how North Melbourne went on the weekend. Match result, obviously, for those of you that have watched or caught up with it, we did go down by 19 points to St Kilda. It was 84-65, and it was a blustery, windy game. Some really weird conditions down in Moorabbin. The sort of stuff that you'd see at a local footy ground, in terms of how windy it was. So that's really what I want to touch on at the start of story of the game. It was windy, and that did make for quite an error-prone game at times. It was mostly blowing towards one direction, but it was a bit swirly at times, and you could just see that those kicks into the wind in particular would really hold up, whereas those kicks going with the wind, sailed. And we'll talk about a few of those kicks as we unpack the match. The Saints really took the game away from us in that first half. Particularly the second quarter, they should have absolutely torched us in that second quarter when they kicked with the wind. But they kicked 3-10 to our 1-1 in that quarter. So it really could have been dead and buried at that point. They had beaten us, outscored us in the first quarter too when they were kicking into the wind. So a fair bit of the damage was also done then. But yeah, I think really when we went in significantly down at halftime, it was always going to be pretty tough. We did manage to take the lead early in the last quarter. After a really great third quarter, we really piled on the goals when we were kicking with the breeze in the third quarter. But yeah, the wind just made it a bit easier for the Saints to finish off the game. Despite us, I thought, holding up pretty well at the start of the fourth quarter. They did kick a couple late, or in the middle part and the late part of the last quarter to make it 19 points. So a pretty comfortable win in the end, scoreboard-wise. Yeah, a really odd game to summarise. Just the wind made such a difference to the conditions each term that whilst there was quite a significant momentum swing from moment to moment or quarter to quarter, there was also a fair bit of adjusting happening in terms of game style, I thought, from both teams. So yeah, it was an odd game to try and summarise in a couple of words, but certainly the tough windy conditions made it challenging for both sides. And I thought in the first half, the Saints handled that a little bit better. I think we adjusted well in the second half, but it was kind of too little too late by that point because we'd wasted the wind in that first quarter. So yeah, that's the story of the game in a nutshell. We were certainly competitive, and there's some stuff to take away from the game. But yeah, initially walking away from it, I didn't really know how to summarise it. So hopefully that gives you some insight into what went on. As is the structure of our match reviews, I'm going to go through the 5 stars now, which I found pretty challenging this week, to be honest, in terms of picking the 4 best North Melbourne players. I've given the 4 stars, or the best player, to Sheezel, and it was a toss-up between him and Fisher. Both of them off half-back just really drove our ball movement, and I thought did some pretty special things at times. Sheezel had 32 disposals, 6 marks, 600 odd metres gained, 5 inside 50s, and yeah, just like he did last year, he was kind of a class above. He had that really penetrating kick at times and could get a couple of 1-2s and chained up. I thought he looked back to what he gave us in that middle part of last year. He did go into the middle a little bit in that last quarter and try to make a difference, and I thought he was fine, but certainly his better football was off half back, and yeah, he looked great. Zachy Fisher, who I've given the 3 votes, had 36 disposals, 6 marks, about 650 metres gained, 8 intercept possessions as well. So he was supporting the Tools in terms of intercepting the ball when it was going into our defence. And yeah, I mean, 68 disposals between the two of them. And I guess the reason part of it is it's easy for them to find the ball, but I think what they were doing with the ball, gave us the drive and the ability to kick 10 goals, which we did. Yeah, that just wouldn't have happened without their risk-taking and their run-and-gun kind of style that they allow us to play. And I think Fisher has really fitted into that role. It'll be interesting to see if Sheezel and Fisher and McKercher can all play that kind of role off halfback throughout the year. Certainly Sheezel and Fisher were the better two in this particular match. McKercher had a couple of issues. I mean, he was fine, but had a couple of clanger kicks, and it wasn't his best performance from the preseason. So, yeah, I thought Fisher and Sheezel really drove our ball movement, and it was just those calculated risks that they took with, particularly by hand, I thought, which gave us a chance at transitioning the ball. And I would wager that our best transitions of the day were probably started or had them, at the early stages of that transition. You could just see that want to move the ball quickly. There was at one point early on in the game where Fisher was almost kicking it back in before the ball had sailed through for a point for the Saints. So, yeah, some great play from the two of them. I've given the 2 votes to Josh Goda, another halfback, which is interesting in itself. 20 disposals, kicked a goal, 5 marks, 8 intercept possessions. And I just thought, yeah, he was a really good, taller foil for the other 2 quicker, smaller halfbacks. That goal that he kicked, is a fantastic contribution for the halfback. He was a decent 50-metre kick. And yeah, I just thought he made some really great decisions all game. Wasn't as clean as Sheezel and Fisher. He did make an error or two, but I thought his decision-making in general was really good. He came off his man a couple of times to help intercept and make an impact, which, it does make a big difference. So I thought in terms of growth for him, that was a fantastic step forward. And I think he's definitely in my round 1 team based on this performance. And that's, purely based on the fact that he's able to kind of play both roles and that he's tall enough to help out on some talls, and he's agile and quick enough to play on some of the smalls and mediums. And he played probably his best game that I've seen him play, just in terms of the whole package. He's certainly had better moments at times in other games, but I thought holistically this was probably the best that we've seen of him. Just one thing worth noting for those top 3 players that I probably thought, it's a mark against them, but between the 3 of them, they had 1 tackle. And I think it was Fisher. It was either Fisher or Sheezel, I think, but that's probably a bit of a concern for me that 3 of our defenders, between the 3 of them, they've got 1 tackle. Now, look, Sheezel and Fisher in particular, that's not their primary role. That being said, if you're playing in the defence, I think you can probably only afford to have 1 player who's got absolute free license to not tackle. So it wasn't a super high tackling game. It was a very run and gun and quick ball movement, which isn't conducive to a high tackling game, but other players did manage to have some pretty high tackle counts. Georgie Wardlaw had 12, I think. So, yeah, you just like to see, a couple of tackles each, in particular from those from Sheezel and Fisher and Goda as well. So just something worth noting. The 4th star, or the 1 star, I suppose, the 1 vote, could have been Dersma. I thought he's probably a bit unlucky for his 2 goals and fantastic marking. I mean, Larkey didn't have a great game and he still kicked 3. He probably could have snuck in for the last star. I thought Dylan Stevens was pretty good on the wing. But I gave it to Tristan Xerri, who had 16 disposals, 31 hitouts, 8 clearances, which was the most on the ground, 4 inside 50s, and just 1 mark. So, yeah, I tweeted after the game and just sort of a bit of stray thoughts that I'd had. And I made a comment that he dominated the hitouts but didn't play a great game. And fair enough, I copped a bit of feedback about that. But all I was trying to say, and I think all I thought was he played a good game, but you'd love him to be great. And I guess, maybe that's being harsh, but as I said, he had 31 hit-outs, but I don't know that he was really giving our midfielders the best service with those hit-outs. I think there's a lot of hit-outs that either went straight to neutral territory or even into St Kilda hands. And I'd love more than one mark. It was probably a hard day for the Talls to read the flight of the ball, and I don't think he's a natural marker. So we saw a couple of St Kilda players that were marking it pretty well in packs. That wasn't the case for us. But yeah, I'd love 2 or 3 marks. So I guess I'm nitpicking. I thought he was our 4th best player, but I would love more from Xerri. I think by the end of the year, we're going to see a lot of growth out of him. And I do have to remember, and I did remind myself that, he's playing against Rowan Marshall, who's probably a top 5 ruckman in the comp, a real bull. And I thought, Xerri really outmuscled him most of the day. So yeah, a pretty good performance by Xerri. He also made a couple of sort of sloppy mistakes where he's getting into people's back or holding his tackles too long, but he's a ruckman. You've got to take the good with the bad. I get that, and he was overall quite impressive, but yeah, probably not as good as he was in the other 2 practice matches against North Melbourne B and Collingwood. In terms of the best opposition player, or at least the player that caused us the most trouble, I thought Machado Owens was really consistent throughout the game. He kicked 2 goals, had 19 disposals, 7 marks, 5 tackles. Just did a bit of everything. And yeah, he did go into the ruck at times. I don't think he got a hit out, so he wasn't impactful in the ruck contests, but when he's playing in there as a midfielder and then has that ability to go forward and make some real challenges for our defence. So I thought he was pretty consistent all game in that he was dangerous and really made us work for it. So I thought he was pretty good. It looked like early days Max King was going to be a real problem, but he quietened down. I think he only had 5 touches in the end. So after a quick start, he sort of settled. And yeah, I thought Owens was probably their best player, or at least their most damaging. So yeah, that's my final 5 stars before the real stuff. I think I've blown out the cobwebs and I'll be able to manage that for the real game in a fortnight or so's time. But that's certainly the structure of how most of the pods will start. Bit of a story of the game, 5 stars, and then we'll jump into the negatives and positives. So yeah, just a call to action. If you're a long-time listener, I'd love you to share the podcast with any North Melbourne fans that help me get the word out there. If you're not already, subscribe to me on your chosen podcast platform. Give me a review on Apple Podcasts in particular. If you could, I can give you a shout out on the show if you can help me out that way. And follow me on social media, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, at Northpod Show is where you'll find me on those services. And if you are interested or you're able to support the show on Buy Me a Coffee, I would really appreciate that. You can find the link for that in my show notes. Let's go to the match analysis. Look at the negatives first. That's generally where I like to start. Sometimes I flip it, but this is where I tend to start it. And it's a pretty straightforward one. First up, I thought the Jimmy Webster hit on Jai Simpkin was just ugly. Towards the end of the first quarter, half forward, maybe 55 metres out, Simpkin kicks it into the forward line, and then, as most people are when they've kicked it, particularly on the run, he's off balance. And Jimmy Webster, who was coming up to apply pressure, for whatever reasons, decide to absolutely smash Simpkin into next week. He's caught him high, his neck really snapped back. It was quite ugly and old-fashioned, and really, to be honest, quite hard to watch. Even though the TV replays just showed it over and over again, I thought we were kind of past that kind of thing. I think, given it was sort of borderline graphic, I would have loved it if they hadn't showed it so many times. But anyway, Simpkin looked like he was in a bad way for a little while. He had that classic, his arms were up above his head while he was on the floor, which is a real telltale, knocked out sign, because often the arms will end up there and not know where to go. He did return to the bench at halftime and he looked okay, but given his history with concussion over the past 18 months or so, you'd think we'll probably be cautious, and I certainly think it's unlikely that we'll see him in round one, which is really unfortunate for him and for the side because he's had a strong preseason. We know that he's shifting into this more of a high half forward that's playing a forward line and midfield time role. He looked okay to start the game, and I thought he was pretty good in match sim. So it's unfortunate for him, and hopefully he is okay long term because we know that these repeated concussions can be a problem. And this is, it's a shame for him because this isn't one of those ones where he's put himself in a vulnerable position. He has absolutely every right to feel like he can make that kick without getting his head taken off. So, yeah, there's been plenty of coverage about Webster and I guess, some of the social media stuff that went on afterwards. So I'm not going to, dwell on that. I think we all know that it was really, really unfortunate and sickening and the wrong thing to do. But I also think it's important to remember that that was a split-second decision by Jimmy Webster, and these things happen on an AFL football field. And whilst we are absolutely trying to stamp it out, I just think there'll probably be a time in the year where one of the North players makes a bad split-second decision. Hopefully not as bad as this. And I feel like in those instances we would want to support our players. So that's really all I want to say on the hit. I think in terms of the game, it meant that Wilfield got more of a run or a run at all. It's unclear whether or not the plan was to get him on or if he was just going to play VFL afterwards. But yeah, he played 3/4, so I suppose that's a positive that we got more of a look at Wilfield. But beyond that, it's hard to draw much out of that, and I don't think we'll be seeing Simpkin in the round one team, although technically he'll be allowed to play because he'll be past the 12 days. But yeah, I think we'd take a cautious approach with him, I would imagine. Second negative, I just thought the midfield performance in general wasn't great. So I spoke about Xerri kind of dominated the hit-outs, but that didn't translate to a midfield dominance at all. And I thought at times we were really getting out-muscled. LDU had a very quiet game, just the 14 disposals and 1 clearance. I thought at times that he was not actually playing in the midfield. It's like my eye was telling me that he wasn't actually attending many centre bounces, but when I had a look afterwards, I think he had 19, and there wasn't many more than that in the game. So yeah, I don't know. I guess he, for whatever reason, he wasn't his best, and it certainly wasn't his day. And then I thought the rest of the mids, were okay, but they weren't fantastic. Phillips, Lazaro, Powell, Wardlaw, none of them had fantastic games. I thought probably Lazaro was the best of those across the game. I thought Powell started well, had a couple of good clearances and some great handballing in tight to release the runners on the outside. But as he tends to in the past, or has tended to in the past, I thought he drifted in and out of the game and didn't necessarily have that staying power. Wardlaw tackled super well. And I think I mentioned before he had 12 tackles. I just would have loved to see him impact the game with the ball a little bit more. He's still developing. I know he's played something like 7 AFL games, so it's not a knock on him at all. But in terms of his performance this game, you really couldn't say that he did too much offensively. Was an absolute bull and tackled hard, and his attack on the ball was fantastic. But he probably even needs to figure out at what points to go really hard at the ball and when's the time to lay off a little bit. So he was okay. We ended up even in the clearance game overall. We lost a set of clearances and won the stoppages around the ground, but I think it was 29 clearances all. So, yeah, I just thought our midfield could have been better. I thought defensively we didn't set up very well through the middle. We got cut up several times with a variety of types of ball movement. So the chip kicks worked sometimes, and the fast movement that we sometimes play also cut us up a couple of times, and it made life really difficult for those that back line, which we know is pretty inexperienced. So yeah, I thought there's all of that. Plus, I just thought, as I said earlier, Xerri dominating the hit-outs, I just would have liked to see us make a bit more use of that. So that's a combination of him and the chemistry with the rest of the mids, I guess. Phillips came on, as I said, at quarter time, and I think he led the clearances for us behind Xerri. Xerri had the most. But, I'd say similar to Powell, I don't think Phillips really had a consistent impact. I thought he drifted in and out. And, they're not all four of them are going to be stars each week, but you kind of need two of that five, if we include LDU, to have great games if we're going to win. And I think that defensive structure that we're trying to set up, I haven't seen it work well, not yet anyway. It's not. We don't have a defense that can withstand the kind of onslaught that we allowed, and that's why the Saints were able to kick whatever it was 3-10 in that second quarter, because the ball was just really waltzing through our midfield, and by the same token, our midfield wasn't able to, or our midfield and our backs weren't able to penetrate through and get the ball out of there when after a behind in that second quarter going into the wind. We did adjust later on in the game, but yeah, quarter two, that the ball movement really slowed down. It was almost Northball was really stuttering to a third negative. I've written here, some old habits die hard. And I think, to me, it was just some of those things that we'd really hoped we'd moved on from were creeping back in. Some clangers, some bad habits, particularly in the second half. Our touch wasn't great. We dropped a lot of marks on the lead. CCJ was one of those players, but he certainly wasn't the only one. There was several that just, had the hands out in front and the ball bounced straight off the hands, which you've got to have softer hands. I know that's what we play the practice matches, to get that touch, but we've also got to critique it when that's happening. At one point, Darcy Tucker and CCJ, who I would say are two sort of fringe whipping boys, combined for a drop mark from CCJ, and then Tucker got caught holding the ball when he had all the time in the world. And sure, I don't know what options he had. Perhaps he was absolutely snookered, but it just had that real vibes of, I've seen this game before. It was a really weird game for Coleman Jones in general. Like, it's had some clangers like that, dropped some sitters, but combine that with kicking a goal from the centre square and a couple of great tackles. So, yeah, third quarter, he essentially grabbed it out of the ruck, took a step, kicked it from inside the centre circle, and I think it was one or two bounces through for a goal. It gave you a real sense for how strong the win was, but that was amazing, to be honest. Like, based on the game that he'd been playing to that point, I think there was a few people online sort of saying, let's try someone else. And he does that freakish, obviously a bit of luck involved, but still freakish. And I thought he tackled pretty well, CCJ. Certainly two strong tackles that he put on inside our attacking 50, which we know tackles inside our 50 has been an area that we've lacked the capacity to exert pressure on the opposition. So, yeah, just a really weird game. He had clangers and he had highlights, which, I don't know, maybe that's the CCJ conundrum. That's what we can expect. As I said, Xerri was hitting it down to the opposition mids, which we've seen before. Miscommunications in defence, which we saw plenty of last year, particularly early on. There was a moment early on where Goda and Dawson both decided to track Max King, which you can understand, and that just allowed Owens a free snap for goal, because Goda had been taking him, but I think Goda was trying to support Cal Dawson. So there was just a lot of those sort of things that I would hope that as the season goes on, we were able to wear away at them, and we're not seeing some of those classic North Melbourne clangers that we've come to know so well over the past couple of years, and particularly from those players that are recidivists. Darcy Tucker, I stand by. I just think anytime he's in our defensive 50, I'm concerned. Similarly, I think anytime there's a situation where CCJ should mark it, I get worried. And that's I guess what kind of the negative that I'm getting at. There's just some of those routines that we fall into as fans, and we innately know that something bad's going to happen, and we want to avoid those feelings. We want players to prove us wrong, which I absolutely do. And then, just a couple of stray thoughts to finish. I'm not really sure how I feel about Bailey Scott off half back yet. I think he had some dicey moments in the game. I'm not ready to say it's not going to work, but I do at the moment prefer him on a wing. And Paul Curtis, we had a couple of quiet players, but Curtis had 5 disposals, 1 mark, and 3 tackles. So it's good to see that he was putting on some tackle pressure, but I just love to see him get a bit more involved in the game. He had such a good game against the Pies. So, yeah, I think, he's putting a bit of pressure on himself really there to hold his spot for round 1 because, as we'll talk about later, there was plenty of players in the VFL that are wanting to come into the side. So, yeah, not a great game from Paul Curtis, but, let's blow the cobwebs out in round 1, I suppose. But let's have a look at the good because there were some real positives that we can draw from this game. I thought Zane Dersma, I have to start there. I think I probably have to admit that I'm wrong on him. I was pretty strong in thinking that he wouldn't play immediately, that he might take a bit of time at VFL level. But yeah, I mean, based on what I've seen today and what I've seen in the intra-club, I think he's ready to play round 1. He kicked 2 goals. He was the player that I was most confident marking it. He was super clean in the air, which was certainly what we heard draft-wise was, his strength, that he's a great mark on the lead and pack mark. He can really take a jump and get himself some separation from his opposition. He kicked 2, as I said, took a mark right before the final siren, and kicking into the wind didn't quite make the distance. It wasn't a great kick, but could have had 3. I thought he fitted in really well with Zerha and Larky. They weren't really getting each other's way. When the ball did go down there, we were relatively efficient, I thought, and Dersma was a part of that. I think similar to Sheezel, but at the other end of the ground for right now, he's just got that really hard to coach nous and knows where to be, knows where to lead. All those things that are just kind of footy brain stuff that's really hard to coach, he's got it. So, yeah, I'd be more than happy to see him in the side for round 1. I've got no doubt there'll be games where he struggles to make an impact, but I think he's just got that goal sense where I think he's good for a goal a game. And, if he plays well, he might kick 3 or 4, but if he has an off game, I still think he's good for a goal because he just finds himself in the right positions enough. So, yeah, another draftee that looks fantastic. It's great that from this preseason we've had a good McKercher performance. We've had a couple of good Dersma performances. So I think we can feel pretty sure that those two are, not going to be busts. Touch wood wherever you are. If you're driving, pull over and touch a tree. We know that Sheezel and Wardlaw look like fantastic players. So, yeah, to have those 4 as really high draft picks that we know are, potentially going to be part of our team for the next 10 years is really exciting. So, yeah, I can't wait to watch Dersma, some more of him, and particularly, at real AFL level, which we'll get a chance to look at soon. Obviously, we have to talk about Northball, and I think at times the transition footy looked really good, particularly via handball. It was just hard to, it was hard to kick accurately in the wind because if you were kicking into the wind, then the ball was often holding up, and if you're kicking with the wind, it was often going over the leading player's head. So when we ran and carried, I thought that we looked pretty good. It was dicey, like handballing it is still dicey in the wind. There was still some ugly disposals, but I thought when we were chaining up with players like Lazaro and Wilfield and Dylan Stevens and Fisher and Sheezel and Powell, like they all played their part in that run and gun, handball to the free player and then just improvise. And I think you could kind of see that we're going to have to refine that as we play more real opposition. But the idea that you can see is that we're engineering these situations where we've got an outnumber, we've got a +1, and then we just improvise and try and move through with that +1. And then you hope that, when another player comes in to equalise and to put pressure on, then you've got one over the back, which happened a fair bit today. It wasn't all success, don't get me wrong. There was several times where it came undone and it looks ugly, particularly when you're going into the wind because one big kick from the opposition and they're back in their goal square. But yeah, I thought whilst it wasn't as clean and as great to watch as it was against the Pies, you could still see that desire to move the ball forward at all cost and try to be fast. There wasn't too many times where we were kicking it long to no one or to a pack. There was most of the time we were trying to go sideways and create some one-on-one opportunities or some outnumbers where we could run it. So yeah, I thought it wasn't as good as I said as it was against Collingwood, but we were still trying it and biting off those tricky possessions. And yeah, I mean, we really didn't start kicking it long until we were about 70 metres away from the opposition goal, which, meant that worst case scenario, we were turning it over 100 metres out if things are going well. So yeah, I thought good to see that we didn't give it up, even though our first half wasn't fantastic. I thought we persisted and adapted relatively well to the conditions in that third quarter, which, yeah, it was definitely when we played our best football, I would say. And I think, lastly, on the positives, it's sort of a weird positive, but just follow me with it. I thought we did not play well, but even though we didn't play well, we were up until halfway through the last quarter. We were well in it, and we were actually ahead early in that last quarter. So to only lose by 19 points to a final side from last year, I think is a fine way to end the preseason. Could have been better, but certainly not a disaster. It just had that weird feeling at the end where you weren't too sure what to make of it. But yeah, I think there was plenty to take away from it. I think we learned a little bit about a lot of players. Callum Dawson started really shakily, gave away a silly free kick to Max King, but I thought was really solid after that, really solidified his spot for round one, I think. Toby Pink was fine, but for me at least, probably beaten a little too often. I don't think he had any clangers or any massive errors, but I think he's going to be great depth, I suppose. Biggie Newen's an interesting one. I think people seem to be pretty high on his game or high on his potential, and I get that. I mean, he's a pretty good intercept mark. I just am a bit shaky about him being one-on-one and making quick decisions. There was that moment, I couldn't tell you what quarter it was, maybe the second quarter, where he'd marked it deep in the back pocket and then hand passed to someone on the way past who was super under the pump. Like, it was an absolute hospital handball. Very, very lucky not to be a direct turnover. So there's just a few of those things where if you're playing in the back half, you've got to be pretty assured with possession and a great kick or a great fast runner. Like, you've got to have some of those attributes that give our team some separation and some distance. So yeah, I guess that's, I think we learned a bit more about players like that. We've got Core and Comben or Comben potentially coming back in that will make a difference to that back line. As I said earlier, I mean, Larky didn't play well, and I thought he was a bit unlucky at times. Like, he was going to kick a certain goal, and then someone gave away a reversal free kick. So yeah, he still kicked 3. So really continuing that strong preseason form that he's had. And I thought in terms of the young midfield, LDU had a really bad game, or at least a quiet game. Jai Simpkin was only there for a quarter, and the other players were solid. As I said earlier, none of them shone, none of them were fantastic, but I wouldn't have said any of them had a bad game too. And I think it's more the defensive side of the game that I'd like to see them get to work. So plenty to like there. And I think a lot of, the things that we learnt, we can put those into our calculations ahead of round one. Some of those things we can work on straight away. Some of those things are going to take some time. But I thought generally speaking, there was some really positive signs from the group in terms of their development in the off season. So that'll pretty much do it for the match review. Just a couple of other news announcements to go through. I might start with the easy one, with the fantastic one. Harry Sheezel, most of you would have seen, has signed up until 2030. So fantastic for the club. We've locked him away long term. He joins Larky and Simpkin as those really long term signings, and I think fair enough from the club's perspective. He's won the All-Australian, he won the Rising Star. He absolutely racked up the possessions last year, and he's continued on that with this year. So yeah, fantastic for us that we've secured him for that long, and it's great to see a player commit to a club like North Melbourne on such a long-term basis. There's certainly, talk that he could be a future captain. I think we're a while off that given, Jai's age, but I think you can definitely see that he's got that potential in him, in the way that he plays, and he seems like a great guy as well. So fantastic to have him. I'm sure Kane Corns would be hating that long contract, but as I have regularly said on the podcast, there's just no need for us to worry about others' opinions other than internally and North fans. So fantastic for Shees and great for stability for the club. In terms of VFL, I will be honest, I did not watch this game. I've read the review, and the North Melbourne website review is always pretty generous with its description, as you expect. According to that, all the AFL listed players played quite well. And look, in fairness, the VFL team did win by 55 points, so there's probably some truth to that. But it sounds like there was plenty of players that pressed their case. We know that players like Comben and Cora McDonald were coming back from injury. I think from what I could tell, Griffin Logue's pretty much the only player that's just not, that might be in the side and it's just not a chance to be fit. It'll be interesting to see if players like Ford and Core and Comben, like if they're in calculations or if they need to play another practice match next week. So that's probably worth noting that the VFL side has another practice game on March 9, which is this Saturday. So, I guess it'll just be interesting to see who plays in that game, and if that gives us a bit of an indication as to, who of those players are still fighting for a spot or fighting for a bit of match fitness. Eddie Ford was certainly the pick of the players in that he kicked 4 goals, so he's put pressure on someone like Paul Curtis. I know they're not, the same player, but they both play forward, and I think there's only going to be 6 or 7 forward line positions available, and with Dersma in the side now, I think he plays. So there's only going to be 1 or 2 extra spots available. 40's 4 goals puts him in the frame. As I said, I didn't watch the game, so it's probably hard to comment on those defenders that were coming back from injury, and the other players like Braden George and Liam Shields and Hugh Greenwood. It's hard to comment on players like that, but I will be watching to see who's playing next weekend, because if they're completely rested, it sort of tells me that they're probably going to play, whereas if they're not, I think it probably means they're fighting for a position. And when I say if they're not playing, I'm talking about the certainties. Like if Ford didn't play, I would take that as that he is probably a bit sore and is going to need some more time. I don't think he's a dead set certainty. Whereas I probably do think that about Core. I think he's a certainty if fit. Just based on the inexperience of our backline, we really needed someone like him as a tallish player, playing either in place of Pink or Newen. And I'd probably go in place of Newen personally, but we'll see. We'll probably talk about that in the next podcast in terms of what kind of balance I'm looking for in that round 1 side. So that's really all I have to talk about. I'll just do a couple of closing thoughts here. Firstly, it's week off this coming week. It's opening round, so there will be, I think there's 4 AFL matches on in New South Wales and Queensland this weekend. I'm not really sure on the logistics or on the reasoning of this, because they first sold it that we were going to go and take over the rugby states while they're out of town, but they're actually in town except for those 4 teams that went to Vegas. So look, anyway, we're not playing opening rounds, nothing for us to worry about, but we will take on GWS in round 1 in Sydney. So a tough start, obviously preliminary finalists from last year. And I really do rate the Giants. I think they're a really hard team to play against. So that's a tough matchup first up away. I'll talk more about that next week, I guess. But that's what we've got to look forward to. I am almost sure that I will have a podcast out in a week or so's time, kind of going through what I think the round 1 team should look like and a few other things. So no week off here. If you're looking for more North content, there will be some either on the weekend or just after the weekend ahead of our game, which I think is on the Saturday of the following weekend. And then just a couple of quick things about the podcast for this year. I'm still needing a name for my Player of the Year award. I'm happy to take suggestions. So if you do have a suggestion for me, feel free to slide into my DMs and give me an idea, because I do not know what to call it. It could just be the Northpod Player of the Year, but if we could give it some other name, I'm more than happy to do that. So yeah, hit me up with some ideas before we start voting in a fortnight or so. And finally, I'm just looking for some other ideas this year in terms of how to interact with the audience. I think it's, I'm not saying that I won't ever send out something saying hit me up with your questions and your thoughts on the game, because I'm sure I will do that from time to time, but I am looking for other ways to be a bit more creative with it, whether or not that's, asking for a 3-word summary of the game, or looking at something really in-depth or specific from the game and kind of talking about that with the fans. I guess I've got a couple of different ideas floating around. So similar, if you've got any ideas around how you would like to interact with the show, feel free to hit me up. I'm always happy to have a chat with a fellow North fan about anything really. So feel free to get involved with the show. As I said earlier, at Northpod Show on pretty much all social media. I think I'm just Northpod on TikTok, but everything else is Northpod Show. That will do us for this episode. Thank you so much for listening and for being a fan. I say it every other week, but I just really appreciate the whole Northpod community. I think it's a fantastic community that we've built and that we are still building. So thank you much. So thank you so much for listening. As I said, I'll be back next week to preview round 1, and let's get stuck in. The practice stuff's out of the way. It's been a long off season. I think we're all ready to play a match for 4 points. So we are nearly there. Have a fantastic week, North fans, and I'll see you next week. Go North. Thanks for listening to another episode of Northpod. If you give me a rating or review on your podcast service, that would be much appreciated. And please follow me on all social media at Northpod Show. I'm on X or Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and I'm also very active on the North Melbourne subreddit. Hope you'll join me for the next episode.